Today we have some more actual history about the dangerous Texas frontier just after the Civil War. We will be reading about an Indian raid that took place near Forestburg, Texas, in September of 1870. Forestburg is located in Montague County, between Dallas and Wichita Falls, not far from the Oklahoma state line. We will be reading from this book, Indian Depredations in Texas by J.W. Wilbarger. This book was published all the way back in 1889. Today's story is about the Keenan and Paschal families, who were living on the very northwestern edge of the Texas frontier in 1870. Mrs. Paschal was a widow living with the Keenans. Mr. Keenan had left his wife and children, along with Mrs. Paschal and her children, alone in their single-room log home, to go to Arkansas to purchase apples to bring back to sell. So here is the story of what transpired when about 9 Indians descended on the home of these women and children, around 10 p.m. one night in September of 1870, when the moon was full. The story of this sad tragedy is given as related by A.J. Sowell, author of Texas Rangers. Mr. Sowell, who was in the ranging service at the time, arrived at the scene of the bloody tragedy soon after it occurred, and ought to be prepared to give a true version of all the particulars. While in camp on Big Sandy, news was brought to us of a fearful massacre of women and children on a small creek about 30 miles north of our camp, near the line of Montague and Wise counties. We lost no time in getting off with 18 men, well mounted and armed, to the scene of the slaughter, and by rapid riding arrived at the place before night, which was at Keenan's ranch, but we soon discovered that it would be impossible for us to follow the trail, as it had been snowing since the Indians were there. As we rode up, we saw 7 new-made graves on the north side of the cabin, under some trees. The settlers from down the country had buried the dead. There were only 2 ranches west of there, Colonel Bean's and O.T. Brown's. Bean was absent at the time. His ranch was about 2 miles from Keenan's. The Keenan house consisted of only 1 room, about 12 by 14 feet, made out of logs. There was a small field south of the cabin at the foot of the hill near the creek. On the northwest side, about 200 yards from the house, was a small lake of water, at the foot of some hills. On the east was a crib of corn. Keenan himself was not at home when the Indians made the attack on his ranch, and massacred the helpless inmates. We dismounted, entered the yard, walked to the door, and looked in. It was a horrible sight. The door was torn from its hinges, and lay in the yard covered with blood. Blood was on the doorsteps. Blood everywhere met our sight. The inside of the cabin was like a butcher pen. Quilts and pillows were scattered over the floor, stiff with clotted blood. The dress which Mrs. Keenan wore was hanging across the girder, which extended from one wall to the other. It had been hung there by some party who buried the victims. We obtained the particulars of the attack from one of the Keenan children, a boy about 8 years old, who made his escape on that fearful night. He said it was about 10 o'clock at night. The ground was covered with snow, and it was very cold. The inmates had all gone to bed except Mrs. Keenan, who was sitting by the fire smoking. On the north side of the cabin was a small window with a shutter, which fastened on the inside with a wooden pin, entering a hole in one of the logs. The door was on the south side. Everything was still and quiet on that cold winter night. The children were all asleep, probably dreaming sweet dreams, which seldom visit the couch except of innocent childhood, when suddenly crash came the end of a rail through the frail shutter, bursting it wide open, and the hideous painted face of an Indian looked in, and began to crawl through into the cabin. One brave man or resolute woman, armed with an axe or hatchet, could have held them at bay, but poor Mrs. Keenan was timid, and instantly sank to her knees and began to pray and beg for her life. As fast as one Indian got through, another followed, until 9 hideous wretches stood inside. By this time the balance of the inmates were aroused. The children began screaming, and the work of death commenced. Pen cannot describe the scene. The cold and lonely night, far out in the western wilds, the painted faces of the Indians lit up by the wood fire, and the frantic and heart-rending cries of the women and children, the sickening blows of the tomahawks, etc. make one shudder to think of it. Who can blame a Texas Ranger for placing his six-shooter to the head of a wounded savage and pulling the trigger, as they often do in battle when they are victors? It was during the confusion that the little boy made his escape through the window by which the Indians had entered. He received a severe cut in the hip with a knife as he went through, but succeeded in getting clear of the house, and was able to run off and hide himself until the Indians left. Crouched in some bushes near the corn crib, and bleeding profusely, he waited and listened until all was still. The work was done. The fiends had reveled in blood. This boy displayed a presence of mind that was truly astonishing for one of his tender years. Before he made his escape from the house, he noticed the number of Indians that had entered, and when they came out to take their departure, he counted them to see if they were all leaving. The Indians had left their horses at the lake, and came to the house on foot, and as the ground was covered with snow, he could plainly see each form standing out in bold relief against the white background. He left his place of concealment and watched them until they mounted their horses, and disappeared over the snow-clad hills toward the west, and being satisfied that they would not return, came back to the house and entered. What a sight for a boy of his age to behold! His mother lay near the hearth, with 3 arrows in her breast, tomahawked and scalped. Some of the children were killed in bed, others lay on the floor in pools of blood. One of the sisters was couched in a corner with her throat cut. There was at least a quart of blood in that corner when we were there. The widow Paschal was lying on the door shutter in the yard. She had 3 broken arrows in her breast. She had broken them off in attempting to pull them out. She was also scalped. The youngest child, about 18 months old, was taken by the legs and its head dashed against the wall of the house, and then thrown out through the window on the frozen ground. But the boy brought his little sister back into the house, and laid her down before the fire, and she recovered. While in the house attending to his sister, he heard a noise in the yard, and on going to the door, saw Mrs. Paschal sitting upon the door shutter, upon which she had been lying. She looked horrible, covered with blood and her scalp taken off, but the brave boy went to her, and she asked him for a drink of water, and there being none at the house, he took a gourd and went to the lake and brought the water. Mrs. Paschal drank the water and immediately expired. On looking around in the house while we were there, I saw the old lady's pipe lying on the hearth, about half smoked out, where she had dropped it on that fatal night. We also saw a bent arrow spike in one of the logs just above the bed. It had been shot at some of the children on the bed and missed. The shaft had been removed. The next evening after the massacre, a settler passed the house and was hailed by the boy, who soon told his tale of woe. The man took a hasty view of the victims and then galloped off to give the alarm. The next day the dead were buried and the news carried to the ranger camp. And when we arrived, the ranch was deserted. The children had been taken away and cared for until their father arrived, who was off somewhere with a wagon, and had one of his children with him, which circumstance saved its life, no doubt. As we could accomplish nothing, the trail being covered with a fresh fall of snow, after about an hour's stay we mounted and set out for camp, vowing vengeance if we should ever meet the red man face to face. Sometime after our first visit to the Keenan place, a small party of us returned after a load of corn. Keenan had returned and was preparing to move away from the frontier. Our captain, hearing of it, had purchased his corn crop, which amounted to about 300 bushels. I was detailed on this trip as one of the guards, and saw the little girl who was thrown out the window and so nearly killed by the Indians. She was very lively, and when we asked her where the Indians had hit her, she would tuck down her head, so we could see the back of it, which still looked discolored and bruised. The boy looked pale and thin. His wound was not yet healed. The dead were as follows: Mrs. Keenan and 2 of her children, the widow Paschal, who was living with the Keenan family, and her 3 children. So that's it for this story from J.W. Wilbarger's 1889 book, Indian Depredations in Texas. Mr. Keenan would remarry following his wife's death. Garrett Keenan appears to be the son who was able to escape. He had a twin sister who is pictured here with him. She was probably the child who went with her father to Arkansas. I am now going to read 3 additional accounts of this attack. As you will see, these accounts differ in some of the details. The first is Joseph Carroll McConnell's book, The West Texas Frontier. The second account is a newspaper article from the San Antonio Express, published shortly after the massacre. And the third account is from a descendant of one of the families who settled in Forestburg, Texas, who added some of the details to the Find a Grave website for Mrs. Susan Paschal. During 1871, the Keenan and Paschal families lived on the Forestburg-Decatur Road, about 3 miles south of Forestburg, in the southeastern part of Montague County. Mrs. Paschal was a widow and had 5 children, namely Bill, Ben, John, Mary, and Dolly, and she and her children were living with Mr. and Mrs. Keenan at the time. Mr. Keenan, accompanied by his oldest daughter, about 14 years of age, had gone to Arkansas in an ox wagon. Mrs. Keenan and her remaining 3 children were at home at the time. About the 1st of April, all had gone to bed except perhaps Mrs. Keenan, when one of the bloodthirsty warriors from the government reservation in Oklahoma stuck his head in the door of the little frontier log cabin. True to her womanly instinct, Mrs. Paschal screamed, and when she did, the Indians made a run on the house. In a short time, Mrs. Paschal was struck with a bludgeon, and perhaps wounded in other ways. Ben Paschal, her oldest son, and aged about 12, leaped through the window only to be speared by a savage, but Ben recovered from his wound. When Will Paschal ran out into the yard, he was badly butchered and almost killed instantly. John Paschal, 6 or 7 years of age, was struck across the bowels with a heavy bludgeon, and died 2 or 3 days later. Little Mary Paschal, 3 or 4 years of age, was also injured, but she recovered. Dolly, the Paschal baby, was left unharmed. But what happened to Mrs. Keenan and her children? Mrs. Keenan was shot through the body, scalped, and died from the effects of her wounds about 11 days later. Mrs. Keenan's daughter, about 12 years of age, was slain almost instantly, and a boy the same age, who is a twin to this girl, escaped unharmed. Mrs. Keenan's infant baby was snatched from her arms, slammed against the window facing, and then thrown out into the yard, where it lay unconscious until the succeeding day. The next morning, one of the Roberts boys discovered what had transpired, and took the wounded to his house. Mrs. Keenan lingered about 11 days, and was conscious most of the time. 5 people were killed, and 3 others seriously wounded. It has been reported that Mr. Keenan, who was almost blind, did not receive the news of this horrible tragedy until he had almost reached his home. Mrs. Keenan prayed almost daily for her husband to arrive before she passed away. When he reached Montague County, however, Mrs. Keenan was already buried. So that was from Joseph McConnell's 1939 book, West Texas Frontier. It seems that he got the year wrong because this massacre took place in 1870, not 1871. Here is the newspaper account from the San Antonio Express. Indian Outrages. From the San Antonio Express, January 18th. From a letter received by a gentleman in this city, from Lieutenant A.C. Hill, we learn of further Indian outrages in the upper country. In Montague County, near Denton Creek, while the man of the house was from home, a party of 9 Indians broke down the windows and doors of the house at about 10 o'clock at night, where 2 women and 8 children were sleeping. They killed Mrs. Susan Paschal, aged about 35 years. They killed Billy, her son, or rather mangled him so that he died the next day. A boy 7 years old named Johnny was dragged into the yard, scalped, shot, and his bowels cut out, while his sister Mary, only 4 years old, was shot in the breast with an arrow and severely wounded. Ben Paschal, aged 12 years, was beaten with clubs and left for dead, but both he and Mary are now slowly recovering. Another of the children was killed by having its brain smashed with a stick, and then brutally thrown into the yard. Mrs. Ann Keenan, the lady of the house, was shot through the breast with 2 arrows, beaten with clubs, scalped, and left for dead. She lived 4 days and then died. Miss Ann Keenan, her daughter, was horribly outraged, and then killed. A child 5 years old was wounded in the bed. The blood of the victims ran through the beds to the floor. In fact, the whole house was covered with blood and hair, and gory clubs used in the hellish work of these fiends. The writer adds, "This same party of Indians, after committing these murders, went on down the country, and stole a lot of horses, on which they made their escape back to their homes. There have been several families murdered besides this mentioned, and if possible with more brutality than that above described. I will tell you my honest opinion. These marauders are the reserve Indians, using the Comanche arrows and signs to mislead the country into belief that they are Comanches who commit these outrages." Lieutenant Hill, who seems to understand the whole question, continues, "The sight of hundreds of lone chimneys now standing on the whole line of the frontier, from the Rio Grande to the Red River, the great number of decaying fences and houses in this vicinity stained with the blood of men, women, and children of all ages, is truly a shame to any nation on earth. You would shrink and shudder if but half were told of the horrid murders committed." In regard to the reception of Rangers, Lieutenant Hill continues, "I am very successful with my dealings with the whole people. We are gladly received by the citizens and soldiers of all this country." So that article added some interesting details, that the eldest Keenan daughter was outraged, and that the Indians may have been reservation Indians who were using Comanche arrows and signs to make it look like the Comanches were the ones who attacked this house. Here are a few additional short details about this massacre added by Sherry Roberts, a descendant of some of the pioneer families of Forestburg. "I am a native of a Forestburg pioneer family, lived here all my life. I am also a member of the Montague County Historical Commission. Unknown Paschal is the same person as Susan Willingham Paschal. She was killed in the Keenan Indian Raid of 1870. I know it is said she was a sister to Mrs. Keenan, but she was not. She was a Willingham, and Mrs. Keenan's maiden name was different. The latest sources I have come from a book by Linda Ruth Clark Stewart, 200 Years of the Paschal Family, very well sourced. Just a bit of trivia, she was not a widow either. Her husband abandoned her and her children in a non-civilized area." So this woman, whose family has lived in the area since it was first settled, says that Mrs. Paschal's husband had actually abandoned the family, rather than died. I haven't been able to find any information about her husband at all, so it's possible that he did abandon his family, and it may have been easier for her to say that he was dead. I also haven't been able to find any information about the Keenan children who were killed, while there are records for some of the Paschal children that indicate that they died in the 1870 raid. The story about the eldest Keenan daughter being outraged before she was killed may or may not be true. The newspaper article from the San Antonio Express is the only mention I have seen of it. Let us know if you have any information about these or any other aspects of the story in the comments. This channel is called Unworthy History because we cover actual history that is now viewed as unworthy to discuss on history channels on TV. This is the history of people who lived difficult lives long ago, people whose shoes we are unworthy to stand in. If you'd like to support our channel, then you can join our Patreon page or become a YouTube channel member. Members will have access to our members-only videos. As a member, your contribution will also be recognized at the end of each episode. So if you want to see more episodes like this, then be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time on Unworthy History.